Hello and welcome to a new episode of Markets and Morality, our IA show where we explore contradicting opinions within the classical liberal free market tent. Markets and Morality is now back from an August break with your host, Adam Bartha, the head of international outreach here at the IA. And today's discussion will very much revolve around domestic policy reform, but with a strong foreign policy angle. As the geopolitical situation has been changing on the old continent and becoming ever more challenging, several European countries floated the idea of reintroducing national service again. Most NATO members decided to opt to rely on professional military carriers during the 90s and the early 2000s reforms, but having war return to Europe may lead to several governments reconsidering their decision. So today's discussion will revolve around the question whether classical liberals should support the reintroduction of national military service. And to debate this, I'm delighted to welcome Elisabeth Braw to the conversation, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on defense against emerging national security challenges. Elisabeth is also a columnist with the Foreign Policy magazine and a member of the National Preparedness Commission here in the UK. And on the other side of the discussion, I'm very happy to welcome Tero Lundstedt, who is the content manager of Libera, Finland's leading classical liberal think tank. Tero is also an expert on Russian foreign policy and has written several journal and book contributions in this area. And he's the co-author of an extensive report on the Finnish ministry's defense that addresses the changing foreign policy of Russia and its impact on its Western neighbor. Elisabeth, Tero, very welcome to the discussion. It's great to have you here both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Elisabeth, I would like to start the conversation with you and your 2019 report, where you have advocated to adopt certain parts of the Scandinavian defense system in the UK, which essentially would mean the introduction of selective national service. Could you elaborate for us a bit and outline how that system would look like, and maybe mention the top 2-3 reasons why you think introducing a compulsory military service would be a beneficial thing to do here in the UK?
Yeah, thank you for having us, Adam. So when people think of conscription, they think of a system where everybody has to serve. It used to be every man, but today arguably every man and woman, and it brings back, for many, it brings back terrible memories, either lived or read about men having to serve essentially as cannon fodder in systems where they were not maybe properly trained, and it was just really seen as pointless. There are really good examples of mandatory national service for men usually, and that a very good example of that is Finland. Another good example of where it's well managed in a completely different geopolitical environment is Israel, where men and women have to serve, but most countries are not Israel and most countries are not Finland, clearly. And so what I think is a fantastic model for the rest of us to look at and to adopt and adapt is the Norwegian model. Now, Norway, like virtually every other European country, with UK as a notable exception, during the Cold War had mandatory military service for all men. Then came the end of the Cold War, and the armed forces didn't really need as many soldiers, conscripts, as they did during the Cold War, because mandatory conscription is really about adding mass to the armed forces. And then in the 90s, we got obviously peace arrived and we had expeditionary warfare, so armed forces didn't need a lot of conscripts anymore, unless they were Finland, of course, with a long border with Russia. So Norway slashed its conscript contingent. So no longer did every man have to serve, every able-bodied man have to serve. Instead, they chose sort of 1/3, initially maybe 2/3 and 1/3 of every year group. So if you were selected, it meant that you were one of the sort of 30% best within your year group. Then in 2016, the Norwegian government decided that a military service should be gender neutral. So all of a sudden it became twice as competitive because you were chosen from among twice as many candidates. And it's a brilliant system, Adam, because yes, it is mandatory. If you're selected, you're supposed to serve. But the thing is, you want to be selected because it is so selective. It's like getting into a prestigious university and you have this thing on your CV that you have been selected to serve in the armed forces. That puts you in a sort of an elite category among your peers in your year group. And it's truly a brilliant system. And my point is that other countries should build on that system, and not just for the armed forces, but for other sort of national security needs. So within the health service, for the countries that do have a national health service, which is almost every Western country, within civil contingencies agencies, within sort of interior ministries, border agencies, so forth. There are lots of other parts of the government these days that have and including finance ministries that have some sort of role in national security, and they should be able to select from any given year group the top candidates for roles that they would train for 6 months, 9 months, a year in roles that these people could then fulfill in case of a crisis. And we'll have more crises. COVID was one, extreme weather events will keep recurring. And of course, we'll have more national security related events, disruptions to energy supply, disruptions to water supply, what have you. National security risks, threats are increasing. And the thing is that if it's a selective system, you are proud to be selected, and you gain skills that are unique, and you will happily do it, and you then form sort of a part of a national reserve that the government can call up in a crisis.
So Tero, you are actually from a country where it's less selective than in Norway. In Finland, every man needs to do compulsory military service for almost a year. So from a liberal standpoint, how do you feel about it? Is it right that people feel proud to do that service? And is there wide societal support for it? And if that's the case, then what's the opposing argument against abolishing it?
Well, thank you for having me, Adam. And just to say about what Elisabeth was saying there, that does sound a lot nicer, the system where you would be among the selected few, the best, and the selection pool would be much smaller. However, of course, this is not the case in Finland. Finland, you are among the selected few just based on your gender, which I just feel that it was there's some heavy historical package why it started out that way in the first place. But the more important thing is that we still have it in the 2020s, and I always thought that if such a system, if one new country would try to introduce or reintroduce such a system, it would never go like that. It would have to be gender neutral, and you have seen this in the German system, for example, that when they have been talking about reinstating the conscription service, it just seems impossible, because they kind of just ran on to the problem that is it for women, and if not, why not, and so on. But so in Finland, of course, all men need to go. Women can go if they choose to. Then you have choices available. If you refuse to do your military service, you can either do 1 year of forced labor, or you can go straight to prison. But if that is, of course, if you're deemed able-bodied when you are called upon to do your service at the age of 18. Since everybody has to do it, it's certainly not they try to market this as some kind of like a source of pride, but obviously it is not. It is like the kind of like slogans we have is that we have such a high a military proudness in our country that people would go even if it wasn't compulsory, and then they show like some statistics that say, oh, this and this many people say they would go even as on voluntary basis. this is, of course, it's nonsense, because if that was the case, we would have the voluntary service, and incredible amount of Finn men would go there as volunteers. Then they don't dare to do it because they know that it is not true. And from the classical liberal point of view, of course, I think the most horrendous system is when half of the people are forced to do this kind of service. And the only worst thing would be, of course, if also the women would be. I just think that then it would be even more expensive and useless system than what we have at the moment. Now, all that
Elisabeth,
yeah, if I just may finish, just to say that all that being said, of course, the Finnish security dilemma is always there, and the defense needs to be we need to have a really potential enough defense policies and practice in place to overcome any threat from any direction. And usually in Finnish case, they only calculate the eastern direction, and then we can go on more length about what that means outside conscription, obviously.
Sure. So moving back to the ideological part, Tero, you called it forced labor, right? I would like to hear Elisabeth's reaction to that, because from a classical liberal perspective, I get your argument, Elisabeth, that you mentioned there may be national security threats or maybe other important crises where drawing on the citizens will become important. But it's really kind of a ready-made system that always continues to recruit their own citizens the best kind of way to do it. Or if big crises happen, if Europe would suddenly find itself with in war with a major power, then we can train our citizens and then we can get engaged. So what's the main advantage of having a constant kind of national recruitment service in place?
Yeah, so it is an imposition on people's individual liberty. Tero is absolutely right, and I think maybe the dilemma that countries like Finland have today, and there aren't very many that manage a military service as well as Finland. In fact, Finland and Estonia, I think, are the best ones in the Western community. But the point is, I think, if you're going to impose restrictions on people's individual freedom, then that imposition should be imposed on everybody. So it shouldn't be just men. Today, I mean, it used to be that men were significantly stronger than women. They are still stronger than women, but obesity, sedentary lifestyle has made that difference. I think has decreased that difference. There are many women that are extremely fit. So why is it that the women are exempted? So we all have to do certain things for the country. We all have to pay taxes. I hope we all pay taxes, but if you are going to impose a burden on a part of society, then it has to be equal for everybody in society. Obviously, ending in this case, ending at a certain age. We wouldn't want the elderly to perform national service. That would be ridiculous, right? But for everybody within a certain age bracket, because otherwise it really is unfair. Which is why the Norwegian system makes so much sense. And on top of being selective, it is really gender neutral. In the most recent cohorts, 34.5% of the soldiers selected on a sort of a completely gender blind basis were women. So it's no longer just a burden imposed on men. Then I think it really is important to remember that there are some times and some periods in our countries where we have to do more than during other periods. So during World War II, clearly citizens needed to do much more, even just as ordinary citizens. We saw it in the UK with block wardens, air raid wardens and so forth. There were lots of tasks that were taken on by ordinary citizens simply because the armed forces can't do everything. And so it's not just a matter of if you either do military service or you do nothing. That the point is that as our societies become more fragile. Well, as there are more threats facing us, I think there's a moral obligation on all of us to do more even short of military service, so that the burden doesn't fall squarely on those who do military service. That would be extremely unfair. And so it is sort of a paradox, I think, that this burden has to be imposed in some cases and in some period during some periods of time on certain members of society. But if that is the case, let's at least make it as fair as possible, so that it's not just one group that carries virtually the complete burden alone.
Mm. So, Elisabeth, you acknowledge that there is a trade-off between individual liberties, but also between, being able to challenge the upcoming issues, right?
But the other part, if I may add, Adam, is that the country, the military service system, the service you perform, and Tero is clearly the expert here because he has done military service, and I have not, because my country did have military service when I was that age, my country of Sweden, but it didn't have gender neutral military service, so I didn't do military service, even though my male counterparts did. But the point is that you have to make it as you have to manage that the military service and the armed forces as efficiently and as well as possible, so that there is a point to these people doing military service. There are other examples, for example, Greece, where it's just a total waste of the conscripts' time, and then it has absolutely no function whatsoever. Whereas in Finland, they get some military muscle out of, they get not just some, they get considerable military muscle out of the military service system, and I think I shouldn't speak for Tero here, but it is the time spent by the conscripts is time better spent than by most other conscripts in most other countries.
What's your assessment, Tero? Is that the case? What's your first-hand experience?
Then, if I may just add one more thing, the country itself also has to be well managed. Otherwise, the other extreme is Afghanistan, where not even the paid soldiers saw a reason to keep fighting for the country. If the country is poorly managed, that no amount of military service will add any value whatsoever to that country's defensive capability.
Sure, that's a fair point. But Tero, what's your first-hand experience on Finnish military training? Is it time better spent than the Greek version of it?
Well, several points. First of all, Elisabeth is definitely right that it's in a well-functioning and administered country. Of course, it's better than in some. Now I need to disappoint you. I did not do my military service. I did the forced labor for 1 year, and this forced labor, I must say about that it's really like its only function is kind of like a punishment, deterrent of all of us, like who are more pacifist minded or whatever is our reason not to go to, or just opposing the system. But anyway, so those of us who decide not to go to army despite being men, then forced labor it is, and it is made as a punishment. It is double as long as the shortest military service. It can never be shorter than that, and it's absolute nonsense. First of all, like, you cannot get money out of it because, remember, it's a punishment. And the kind of like there are these like compulsory classes we need to attend, and I'm sorry to say that they almost couldn't be more bigger waste of time. So I think Finland manages many things well. They take sort of good care of like the military people's rights and relative freedoms and rights while doing the service and so on, but like not everything about the system is definitely, it looks more rosy at the outside. It's not as well managed as you think, and my first-hand experience being from the forced labor part, but then I just think that it's also quite disgraceful that we actually have these kind of, like, you could call them political prisoners, but those who refuse everything and they just go to prison, and they are there seriously only for their gender. In 2020s, it's kind of like, it's like, I find it like a stain, in the Finnish otherwise pretty good record on such things. So it's just that if you really look deeper into the Finnish system, then the flaws, the cracks start to appear in it.
So you're super negative about the Finnish system at the moment, but nevertheless, there is wide societal support for it. So as far as I know, almost 80% of Finns do support compulsory military service. What do you think the reason may be for that?
We used to have this kind of like a national mantra up until this year. And I have been criticizing this mantra for a very long time, but it was that the Finnish army builds up this strong deterrent that Russia, if they are deciding on attack, because we know what kind of neighbor we have, we knew it before this year even, but so that the mantra went that the Finnish army is so strong that Russia will do this cost-benefit analysis and will decide like, oh, no, these numbers don't look good, it's not worth it. They don't do it. But then, you know, with the Ukraine war, like I just think that Finns did not wake up, you know, enough. But there was the Georgian war; it was almost unnoticed. The Crimean war, like the Crimea crisis, and so on. The war in the Ukraine's east, Finns still kept their eyes, you know, wide shut. But then, when this war started, that was kind of like a different. And our, like, you know, the president and the government, they really now reacted a lot more strongly, and all of a sudden Finns kind of like gave up on our mantra. Yeah, of course it's not a strong deterrent, of course we cannot take on Russia alone, so that's why we now applied for NATO. But so I think that the Finnish support is not really for this system, it's more like for that obviously we need to have something real to keep the, you know, Russians out. That's it. And I think that this kind of I've been predicting for a long time that when the NATO membership in this country happens, that the support will start to erode, and hopefully, in my perspective, sooner or later we will be able to move more first towards the Elisabeth's like she's been advocating the Norway model, which sounds of course a lot better from liberal standpoint than the correct Finnish one. But the trade-off is not, I need to emphasize, is not less security for Finland. I think Finland in NATO with smaller army is so much safer than it was outside NATO with no matter what kind of Finnish army. That's it.
Elisabeth, do you agree with the assessment that more countries are going to be moving towards the Norwegian model? You know, even countries that have a larger reservist force at the moment, but maybe also countries that have no national service at the moment whatsoever as a result of the Russian war? Or how do you think that the scenario is going to change in the next couple of years as a result of the escalating conflict with Russia?
Yeah, so lots of countries are thinking about and discussing reintroducing military service, and what we've seen in the countries that have made some sort of decision is that they have decided not to introduce or reintroduce Cold War military service, so whole scale again, simply because we just don't need these sort of mass armies anymore. We need highly skilled soldiers, and we are really far beyond the traditional sort of trench warfare that needed that sort of volume. And we should remember that's how conscript armies started. You needed mass, and so that's why I think that the French and then the Prussians introduced it way back when. And so the reason we had it during the Cold War is obviously that we saw there was a risk of this sort of massive clash between the Soviet side and the Western side, and the Soviet side had conscription, not out of any democratic decision, simply because the governments there got to decide as they wished. But so the countries that have made a decision in recent years, so that's Sweden and Lithuania, both of those countries have introduced a selective system, and Sweden has a sort of a hybrid now with, as of 2017, with professional soldiers topped up by conscripts, and that service, or that the conscription now is gender neutral. It's relatively small numbers, but it's gender neutral. Lithuania similarly has a selective system, not as selective as the Norwegian one, but the idea is the same. You only take the soldiers you need, and so it has this double benefit of not not burdening the armed forces with soldiers they don't need, but also making it selective, also making it attractive because it is selective, and you don't have to serve along with dozens of people who would rather do anything other than being there. So I think that's what we'll see in other countries as well. And the benefit of that is that the government at any given moment can, or the armed forces should be the deciding institution here. They get to decide how many soldiers they need, and then based on that you select. You don't just say, well, everybody's going to serve, or X number of soldiers are going to, or X number of teenagers going to serve. So it's just a clever system, and it seems to be where the debate is heading, and other countries are having this conversation.
Sure, but as we know, the government likes to expand. So if it's up to the military to decide how many people they want to have, I can imagine that they may decide for a bit more than.
And then there is another point, and the obvious pitfall is this one, that governments or political parties, commentators will often say, well, you know, the youth should be involved in something, because we need more youth involvement in society. We need to train teenagers to become good members of society. We'll introduce military service. That is absolutely the wrong way to go about it, because military service is about training teenagers, 18, 19 years.
It shouldn't be daycare.
Exactly. And so you can, something I've advocated for, and that seems to be beginning to happen now, is National Resilience Service for teenagers on a voluntary basis, where you can learn some crisis response skills, first aid, and so forth, and become active as part of a society-wide response to extreme weather events, pandemics, various outages of critical services. And that makes you a good member of society, and it wouldn't have to be mandatory, because it brings immediate personal benefits to the person who learns the skills, and it also brings benefit to the community.
So just a short final question to both of you. Let's imagine that Elisabeth's ideal model, the Norwegian model, will be adopted across the EU in the next 10 years. So 1/3 of the new young recruits are going to go through some sort of military training or national service. 1/6, I'm sorry. So a fewer number, but nevertheless, a reasonably significant chunk of society will go through some sort of military service. How do you think that's going to influence foreign policy when it comes to NATO and to threats that the EU may face? So do you think that, you know, if you think back on the last 2 decades, NATO obviously did perform certain roles outside of the borders of Europe as well, most notably in the Middle East. Do you think if there would be a compulsory military service introduced and more people would experience it, do you think there would be less support for some of these foreign endeavors? Or do you think society may become more militarized and it would actually have a net negative effect when it comes to conducting a peaceful foreign policy?
Well, I think that it might indeed slightly decrease the support and maybe the appetite for countries to join such endeavors abroad, if you indeed would have to send conscripts. However, if I understood the Norwegian model correctly, there's the core professionals, and then on top of it, there's the limited amount of conscripts. I would think that in such cases, it would be the hard core that would be more likely to be sent in these kind of missions than, you know, the conscripts with less service time. Am I right?
I assume so.
Yeah. So Norwegian conscripts and I think most Western conscripts are not sent to active conflicts. It's always just the professionals.
But do you think that the kind of cultural and societal impact, Elisabeth, do you think that it would kind of help Europe to conduct a very strong defensive kind of military and foreign policy? Or do you think that there is a danger of more people being part of military services, becoming more militaristic in their geopolitical mindset?
Yeah, I think anybody who has served in the armed forces has a very realistic view of war and what it's like, and they are not going to, by and large, they're not going to be the sort of people who push for war simply because it's a very painful business, and it should only be waged when there is no other option. But Adam, I think what will happen is that we'll have a sort of a critical mass of people who think about foreign policy and think about security policy in particular. And it's so easy when you're not part of this community at all, whether as an ex-conscript or whether as a national security academic like Tero and I, it's so easy to just completely disconnect from this whole field, which is so critical to our societies and which will become even more critical. And if more people have been involved in some sort of capacity, even as the lowest sort of peg on the totem pole, I think that will lead to societies where there's healthier engagement, citizen engagement with national security and the risks that our societies are exposed to and will be increasingly exposed to.
On this optimistic note, I would like to finish and thank you very much, Elisabeth and Tero, for the exciting insights. I very much enjoyed the conversation. But of course, many thanks to our viewers as well who have joined us today. Please do let us know your thoughts below the video in the comment section or on Twitter at IALondon. And a special thanks to our donors as well, without whom our work at the IA would not be possible. And if you do wish to contribute and support our work, please consider becoming a Patreon subscriber, where you can receive some exclusive content and have a sneak peek into behind the scenes as well. But for now, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time again.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.